Several people have noticed a major problem with the collision detection that we've made to this point, which is that it works great as long as the ball bounces off the paddle as expected. But you can make miraculous and inappropriate saves by sideswiping the ball. So let me illustrate here. So see how I sideswiped the ball and I've saved myself? So why does that happen and how can we fix it? If you remember the way that our if statements work, we were testing to see if the bottom point of the ball was inside a certain region defined by the paddle. So we looked at the left-hand side of the paddle and the right-hand side of the paddle, and we looked at the top of the paddle. And we said if the bottom point of the ball is anywhere inside this region, then have the ball reverse its vertical direction because we think that it's bouncing off the paddle. And if the ball had hit the paddle from above, that would be true. As soon as the bottom point of the ball crosses the top of the paddle, it's in that zone, and we would want the ball to reverse direction. But if the ball is already down here and we've missed it, and we move the paddle over, we don't want the ball to end up over here, and we'd say, aha, the point is inside the region, therefore we must have bounced. Because what ends up happening is what you saw. The ball will continually bounce up and down and up and down and up and down because it thinks it's supposed to be bouncing until eventually it gets to the other end of the paddle, and then it will continue on its upward trajectory, which is not what we want. So one thing you can do that's really easy is just make the paddle less tall and move it as close to the bottom of the screen as you can. But there's one more thing that's helpful. What would be really nice is as soon as the bottom point on the ball crosses the top of the paddle, if the ball is horizontally between the left and right-hand side of the paddle, then we want it to bounce. But if it's outside the bounds of the paddle, then the player's already lost. So we should declare at this point that there's no bouncing and that there's no recovery, and we should just let the ball continue to pass through to the bottom of the screen. So in other words, we want to stop responding to the paddle as soon as this lower point crosses that threshold. So how could we do that? I think a nice approach would be to make a Boolean variable up at the top of your program. And if you remember, Boolean is a special data type that means true or false. And we could call it something like is in play. Because the idea is, if this variable is true, this is supposed to say true, if the variable is true, then we'll treat the ball as if it's in play. So we'll test to see if it's hitting the paddle. If this variable is false, then we'll just ignore it, and we'll continue to draw it until it's off the bottom of the screen, but we won't ask if it's hitting the paddle at all. So let's pretend that you've got your if statements that are about whether or not the ball is hitting the paddle and about bouncing. Let's say these are all your if statements for that. So if the ball is between the left-hand side of the paddle and the right-hand side of the paddle, and it's below the top of the paddle, then we bounce. And this is the code that we've already written. So what we want to do is put all of that inside a larger if statement that says, only do this test if the ball is hitting the paddle, if the ball is in play. So you can say if is in play equals true. Then go ahead and do this stuff. If the ball's not in play, then the if statement won't be true, and you'll skip over all of that, and you won't even ask the question, is the ball hitting the paddle? Okay, but if we set the ball to be in play at the very top of the program, and then inside draw, we only bounce it if it's in play, when do we decide that the ball is out of play? So it's what I said. If the ball is not between the left and right-hand side of the paddle, but it's past the top of the paddle, that's when we want to set the ball to be out of play. So what we can do actually is we could add an else statement. Here we could say else. And what we're saying else to is we're saying else to this outer if statement. So if the ball is between the left and right-hand side of the paddles, we'll do this stuff. If it's not, we'll jump down here, and we'll ask the same question. If the ball is below the paddle, then what we'd want to do is not bounce, but we'd want to set is in play to false. So is in play equals false. And the idea here, again, is if the ball's in play, here we're going to ask if it's hitting the paddle. But if it's not hitting the paddle, then we want to ask, is it still true that the ball is below the top of the paddle? Because if it is, then we want to tell it that it's not in play anymore. As soon as we set this variable to be false, nothing's going to change visually. But what is going to happen is the next time we come through the draw method, we'll get down to this if statement, and now is in play is false. And so we'll skip over all of this. So we won't even look at any of it anymore because the ball is already out of play. So then the only last thing that you'd have to fix is in the code that figures out when your ball has crossed the bottom of the screen, you have to set is in play back to true again at the same place where you reset its position. Because if you're resetting everything for the next round where the ball reloads up here, then you also want to say that it started to become in play again. I hope that this has been helpful.